I take it we're supposed to start. So I will go relatively quickly through a good bit of stuff, as is my wont. So we have time for more conversation with Rob, with Hal, both of whom are doing this session with me, but for efficiency purposes, I'm the one who's speaking fast. I'll go relatively quickly through the reports that we published last year and the CJR and later on in our own independent report. The high level, you want to start running the time so that I know that I'm not wasting too much time? Thank you. At a high level, we took somewhat over 2 million stories from the 18 months before the election, mapped them both based on media linking practices and tweeting, co-tweeting practices, and sized the nodes either by in-links from other media sources, which we took as a sign of authority among media producers, or by tweets or by Facebook shares that we took as measures of influence in media. This is the least separated structure, which is based on media in-linking. This is zooming in a little bit. And the critical thing that we saw was that rather than a model of polarization, where the left goes left, the right goes right, and we just have no center, what we saw instead quite clearly was that the center left, the left were all structured around traditional media, and the right has its own sphere that's more insular than the others. The colors here of the quintiles are based on audience attention ratios, based on how often a particular site is tweeted by people who follow Trump versus by people who follow Clinton. Turns out to be a really good measure of sites, very closely correlated with other measures that we've seen. One of the things that's very clear, because of a different study that we did in 2012, the architecture is not that different from 2012 to the extent that we think that 2016 is fundamentally different. We already saw a very similar structure in 2012, so we're looking at a longer term phenomenon. Once we moved to social media, the thing that really jumped out, which at the moment seems, yeah, we all know this, but at the time was pretty new, was just how central Breitbart was, even before Bannon came on board. And that was true both by Twitter shares and even more so by Facebook shares. What I want to suggest to you now from brand new 2017 data with a cutoff date of essentially inauguration until 12 months later is that we've seen, as I said, that's the Facebook data that's even more separated. I guess I'm mixing up my talks. Okay. One of the things that's very clear is that even in media in-linking, and certainly once you move to social media and more extreme even in Facebook, you have an asymmetric polarization model. The right, the more right you are, the more attention you get. In the left, you have an almost normal distribution running from the center or even center right all the way to the left, clustered around the older, more traditional media. And for us, this is critically important because what we believe we're observing is that even though the underlying psychology may well be exactly the same, even though the underlying interventions by whoever is trying to sow disinformation may be the same on the left and the right, it appears that the left and the right exist in different media architectures, and that the right occurs in an architecture that reinforces these extreme and conspiracy beliefs, whereas the left exists in an architecture that constantly checks it to the center because there's mixed attention, some to the crazy and some to the not, and the not operates in a different normative and organizational structure that counteracts some of the insanity. One of the things that's in tension between what our older work, last year, work was and what we're doing now is this recognition that television continues to be most important for the US. And there's beautiful work Gensko and Olcott and Gensko did, Boxell et al. Did over the course of the year, basically showing, look, if you're just talking about who voted for Trump, it's people who use social media less and television more. It's people who are older, it's people who are more male. What's going on? And so one of the things that's very clear is that video is really important. And when you look at it online, it looks like YouTube, A, is very right-wing, and B, is in an even more separated environment. So two things to see here. One, the environment seems, this is the difference between 2017 and 2015 to 16. There's even starker separation between the right and the rest. The rest is more tightly connected in one cluster trying to hold on to reality. The right is reaching escape velocity and through YouTube. We're doing a couple of different things with YouTube. Oh, by the way, just in case you thought YouTube was causing this, if you remove YouTube, you get the same even starker separation. It's not driven by YouTube. We're doing two different things with YouTube. One is this looking at YouTube videos as the nodes, sized by how often they're shared on Twitter, linked by who co-shared a video. This, unlike everything else you'll see, is just a straight Louvain community detection coming out of the data. And what was so interesting to us is we, through qualitative research, had seen that when Breitbart released the Clinton Cash video in July of 2016, it was clear they were oriented it towards the left and to separate out the Democrats, the Bernie crowd from Clinton and suppress it. But we saw that from reading the materials. What happened once we did this was that the community detection also saw it. So the green here is Bernie, and Clinton Cash is sitting right on the border, but based on tweeting behavior is being tweeted by the burners. So you really get it from the data. And part of what we're trying to do is essentially treat YouTube as its own source and understand the sharing patterns in order to understand. The second thing we're trying to do with YouTube is understand what's going on in YouTube. So one particularly interesting case study is Uranium One, which has a very interesting temporal signature of very early, before the campaign starts. It blows up as part of the Clinton Foundation story. And then it really blows up in October 2017, almost a year after the election, as part of an effort to discredit Mueller and that investigation. But when you actually look at what on earth is going on YouTube, and I talked about this morning, it's all Hannity, and some of it is Fox and Friends, and I showed you some of those things. So part of what's happening with YouTube is that you get extreme right-wingers like Red Ice or Styx Hammer, I can't remember the exact name, who are out there. And that's more what we expect of what's crazy out on YouTube. But actually the majority, this is based on number of viewers as reported by YouTube, not on any other link. Overwhelmingly, it's just Fox News. And remember, when 500,000 people share Hannity, that's still a fraction of the 3.5 or 3.15 million average viewership he has on his TV show. So there's an overwhelming role here for Fox, coming back to the point about structure. The other interesting thing that happened is if you remember that image where Breitbart was big and central when we sized things based on Facebook. When you look at sizing by Facebook this year, it's looking like Fox News and Breitbart have, first of all, become more similar. There's a dual anchor here. But second, again, there's a lot more focus on traditional media, a lot more energy in the center and center-left and left. And even though you have something as crazy as Occupy Democrats over there really big on Facebook in a way that it wasn't on Twitter, let alone on linking, still the center focus is on the traditional media. Let's shift now and talk about how Facebook was particularly a particularly effective site for dissemination fake news. Where's Claire? We have to say, essentially of Macedonian teenager type, in this case, Romanian 20-something-year-old type fake news. And the supposed importance of that. The most important story, or the most widely Facebook engaged story based on the BuzzFeed story, was this particular one, which was based on one of the Podesta emails. And in fact, when you look at Facebook sharing on Ending the Fed in October, it's really big. It's not as big as Breitbart, it's not as big as Truthfeed, but it's really big. Important to understand, and this is something, Kate, that you were talking about when we were talking separately about the remix. So one of the interesting characteristics is you look at components of the story, and some of it is new and based on Podesta, but then you just sort of layer in, and by the way, there's 20% funding from Saudi Arabia, which is something that gets circulated by an author from Zero Hedge who's republished on InfoWars and on Fox Nation in June. And that's based on some other hack of Petra News Agency. We can go into that if you feel like it. It's really fun stuff. Again, if we go back to the bimodal network that Hal put together of the emails and stories, this congrats email is the one that's about ISIS. Your friend, Your Newswire, is right up there. Ending the Fed is when you size it by Facebook sharing, but when you size it by Twitter sharing, they go away. So the critical thing is you're getting cross-platform distribution with different players, and the central players continue to be Breitbart, Daily Caller, Fox News across these platforms. Remember, we're looking for the architectures of amplification rather than for discrete moments of dissemination. And that the critical difference between right and left, or between right and rest, because it's not really left, it's everybody from Forbes on to the left. It's really, it's right and the rest, rather than right and left. The architectures of dissemination are different. So a little bit more time on what I already showed this morning, because I think this is one of the clearest things. We tried to say, okay, let's look at how the diffusion happens. Let's take two very similar, nasty pieces of defamation and see how they diffused. The one that's identified in blue is the story that Trump raped a 13-year-old at a Jeffrey Epstein party. The one in the red are stories that Bill Clinton flew with same-said Jeffrey Epstein to Orgy Island on the Lolita Express, and in later iterations that Hillary joined on 6 times. When you take some of the very worst of the top 10 most Facebook shared bullshit sites, you see when you look only at Facebook that in fact there is symmetric dissemination, but not once you move to the more authoritative link-based media. And so when you try to see an image of the difference in architecture of dissemination, this makes it very clear that Facebook over here in the center does have some semblance of symmetry, but not quite. But there's absolutely nothing either in Twitter, which is somewhat more elite-oriented and perhaps somewhat more manipulable as far as bots go, and certainly not in link-based, which is the most authority-based media. There's identical asymmetry, showing deep structural difference between the stable structures of most respectable, as it were, or at least most widely viewed media on the right in the way that simply doesn't exist on the left. Going back to this fabulous tool that Justin's developing on trying to actually break it down, this is on a different email. This is on the satanic cooking. And one of the things is you do see the first Reddit thread that shows up on satanic cooking also happens to be the first Reddit thread that begins to introduce the idea of pizza, though not yet Comet Pizza, just pizza more generally. And it also has a story about it on We Are Change by an author who moonlights at Sputnik as well as We Are Change. I'm not sure which is moonlighting and which is not. But she also writes a piece that shows up around here just before midnight which ends up being one of the core sources that this WikiLeaks, the first Facebook post that shows up as a Facebook public page post, comes from WikiLeaks. It's also the same links that on their WikiLeaks tweet were sent out. And that's to a different story on We Are Change by the same author that ends up becoming the primary source of citation for the InfoWars story at 8 a.m. the next day, which in turn, after 3 hours, gets replicated by Sean Hannity. And it really has these two sources. It has this We Are Change story, which is written by Fairbanks, and it has this Mike Cernovich, Joan, all of you, this alt-right character, Mike Cernovich. You can describe who exactly the character is. But basically, you've got the classic story that we have. It's the Russians. It's the alt-right. But fundamentally, it's about the architecture of dissemination, how it goes from that through InfoWars to, by 11 a.m., Sean Hannity. And with Sean Hannity, to the millions. This is, it turns out, on LifeZ, and from there to the Washington Times. And by the end of the 24 hours, it's all over the right-wing media. There is a certain strategy to this. This is May 2017, around the days that Comey is fired. Then there's a release of the fact that, and then there's the Mueller nomination. And what you see very clearly when you look at the 5 quintiles, left, center, center right, and right, what you see very clearly is that around the Comey firing, there's a very clear left and center left led spike, but nothing on the right. Around the nomination of Mueller, there's a very strong center-led coverage focused both on Trump, Russia, and on impeachment. But on the same day, you have the Seth Rich story trying to say, no, it's not the Russians, it's an internal DNC job, and you have a DNC staffer who supposedly was murdered by Clinton. Critical to understand that, again, is led by 4:30 a.m. Fox 5 DC, replicated at 6:15 and 7:15 and 8:15 across Fox and Friends, and then Hannity across the network for over a week. By the end of the week, even though before the end of that same afternoon, the supposed source came out publicly on CNN and said, I didn't say these things. There's now a defamation suit that he sued Fox for having put those words in his mouth. It takes a week before Fox removes the video, and it doesn't change, and it doesn't prevent Newt Gingrich from saying, because it turns out it wasn't the Russians, it was this DNC leaker, something for which he got a pants on fire from Pundit Fact. But again, critically in a different architecture. Because when you try to look at the winners of Trump's fake news awards from January of 2018, and you go story by story, and each one of them, Brian Ross gets suspended for 4 weeks. The correction happens within 6 hours. 3 journalists leaving CNN, the story comes out, the mistaken story suggesting a closer connection between a Russian bank and the Trump campaign comes out on a Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, it's retracted. By Monday morning, the 3 journalists are out, and there's reporting all over the press, in the Times, in the Post, in the Guardian, about what a terrible mistake it is. Each and every story, what you get is an institutional, organizational, and cultural commitment to getting it right. That's why I was pushing back a little bit on the idea that there's a loss of truth, because when you look at where everyone exists from who's not inside the right, this is the center of attention. This is the organizational culture. This is the set of professional norms, and they have real consequences. People are out on their asses within hours for getting it wrong, which does not prevent, this is use of the term fake news on the right, the left, and the center left that Hal sent me this morning. This is what happens, right? Each of these stories is a way of saying, see, they're all fake news, despite the fact that you have this deep correction framework. We're back, Brittany, to what you were describing earlier about the difference between what happens inside the norms of science when you don't take any single paper as truth, but where somebody from the outside can grab one piece and say, see, vaccines, fluoridation, this is the same thing. See fake news without the report. It's what Richard Hofstadter called the pedantic character of the paranoid mind, where you're collecting these disconnected facts to ground the fact that you're not paranoid, they're really after you, but not because they really are after you. So I want to stop there. I sort of sketched out this morning already this idea of trying to map the different sources of potential threat from Russian propaganda and the Trump campaign through the Macedonian teenagers and the alt-right on this model of whether they're decentralized or centralized, political or commercial, and whether whether the sources of change are technological or institutional. But I don't want, I'd much rather have the conversation and have Hal and Rob, do you want to come and sort of sit with me here and just open for questions of any kind and have a few more minutes for conversation? Anyone? Do we have a mic for anyone other than the one we're holding for answers?
Thank you so much. I'm from University of Washington. So could you elaborate on the exciting tool just invented by Justin, the tool that you can precisely map what happens within 24 hours?
Yeah, it's not actually that exciting. It's mostly just a timeline constructed from data that we're pulling from a bunch of different places and doing some cleanup to make sure that the timestamps are correct. And that's about it. And then we link out to every story, and then the rest of it is pretty manual. But it gives you the ability to see what's coming up. You know, when are the early, who are the early players, and how is the conversation moving from platform to platform.
Joan, you wanted to come in? Oh, great. So there's Joan over there. Thank you.
Yeah, it was really my gasping at that example. So that We Are Change group formed during Occupy, and it's an Occupy streamer that is then he's kind of built out this platform, and he's been known to do a lot of anti-Semitic reporting around quote unquote the globalist agenda. And then the other person that you pointed to, Cassandra Fairbanks, is also someone in this space that has written for Sputnik, comes out of Occupy as well, was also a member of Anonymous and had been outed as one of the admins of a very popular Anonymous account in early 2011, 2012. And so it's like, I just keep coming back to this. These techniques that were learned then still seem to work. And then some of these people have learned how to use them, layering them with technologies of, Patreon and other donations in order to keep up the business of it. And the way that you describe that flow, we have similar models where it moves from 4chan into a blog space and then on to Tucker Carlson, who really, it seems like his newsroom editors are looking for this content in these spaces, and they do these A/B testing to see what resonates with crowds on Twitter, and then they do that framing in their nightly reports.
Have you described that particular technique yet anywhere publicly? Because I haven't seen that written.
No, but we've been working on looking at that with this It's Okay to Be White campaign, and so I've been writing about this, but I haven't published. So it starts on 4chan. It's just it's a white sheet of paper. It just says it's okay to be white. And then what they do is they bring that, they encourage people to print out that flyer and post it in schools, at universities, and malls, so that anyone like us would go up to it and take a photo of it and say, oh my goodness, look at what's here. There's white supremacists in our town. And this is part of the source hacking model that I'm looking at, where then about 2 weeks later, we saw it appear on Tucker Carlson and his, he does this campus craziness segment every couple of weeks, and it's, can you believe that people would react to this poster in such a way? But it's completely divorced from the context of the meme culture and the white nationalists who put it together and are doing the messaging around it. And so, and we've seen a few of these now where they come out of this and then they either end up on blogs or in public spaces. And so it's worth noting that this is more than just Hannity, but also that there are some known quantities in this space that would be really easy for platforms to solve for.
And by the way, Fairbanks moved from Sputnik to Gateway Pundit around January.
Yeah, and for a while she was doing Bigly, and yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be learned from her case alone.
Oh, you're taking it around? Who else? By the way, I think that this timeline tool might be very useful for you in terms of qualitative analysis. Just sort of, I think it's exactly built for the kind of thing that would be a very productive for you, because it helps setting up when and how things connected across the multiple platforms.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very interesting. I had a question about the internationalization of some of these, conspiracy theories, disinformation, and campaigns in general. Have you also mapped, I don't know, the turning points of where these, or the timeline of when these stories also became important internationally speaking, or also when talking, for example, about campaigns such as the It's Okay to Be White campaign, for example, looking at how key influencers then in Europe took over the same campaigns and adopted them to a regional context. For example, in Germany, it was then Es ist okay, Deutscher zu sein, I think that was the campaign, which was modeled after the American one. So yeah, I'd be interested in the role of key influencers and the connections to, the transatlantic connections, essentially.
So we haven't. Media Cloud, is Rahul around? What are the numbers? Media Cloud now has so much data from, we're sort of close to every country in the world, I believe. I think the theory was there are even 3 sources. Hal, what's the, where do we stand in terms of that?
We have, as of the past few months, much better, very broad international coverage. So point number 1 is most of the stuff you saw up here, Media Cloud just does via its public tools. We built Media Cloud to be an open platform so that anybody can do it. That's been the idea for the past 8 years. So the short answer is no, we haven't done that because we've been working 18 hours a day to do this, and that's what we know. And also because we feel a little bit like a core principle of the way that we work is using the quantitative data as roadmaps for deep qualitative analysis, right? So we show the pretty maps, and those are fun, and it's always exciting to have them, but the real work goes in understanding what's actually happening behind that map, which involves just reading lots of stories, and also all of us on the on this U.S. elections team we're all sort of political nerds and deeply engaged in this specific U.S. politics context. So for us to go and try to do this in Germany, we can do it. Someone who's an expert in Germany needs to do that. We'd obviously be happy to help, and our tools and platforms are there. There's some issue with the U.S. One really nice part about studying the U.S. is it has a very nice, still has a vibrant open web where a link economy exists. That's true mostly in Europe and lots of other places of the world. That's just not true. The open web is basically completely dead. There's no link economy. So that provides additional challenges, which we have other ways of solving, but can make some of this stuff more difficult.
Thank you.
But it's not a principled reason to not want to look at the U.S., and it's not just U.S. centrism. Our house is on fire. We're trying to figure out where the fire is. That's for us. But we're happy to talk to anybody who wants to try to implement something like this on their country with their knowledge. That's the best thing we could hope for the platform to be able to do.
I'm Laura Nixon from Berkeley Media Studies Group, and I'm wondering what's known at this point about the effect of all this on voting behavior And one of the things that's making me think about that is I saw a talk recently where someone who's looking a lot at all the different data coming out of the election, and his hypothesis is that many things happened in the election, but part of it is that the Trump campaign was able to mobilize voters on the right that normally do not vote or have not voted in past elections, where there can be kind of an obsession with like, oh, we've got to like get the center, we got to like move to the center, but really the success came in mobilizing voters sort of on the right who normally would not be activated, and that it just made me think of it when looking at that sort of lopsided graph. So I'm wondering if you know anything about those kinds of trends.
Qualitatively, it seems unassailable. Quantitatively, the data's not there. It's always been the kind of the bête noire of that field is trying to figure out what media impacts are, and it's very, very difficult to untangle. We want to know both how people's opinions are changed, but how their behavior are changed, and it's very difficult at this scale of activity. But I think your core point is a very good one, is that a big part of the Trump victory was in an enthusiasm gap where his people were really riled up, and I don't think you could make the case that they could maintain that kind of level of commitment and energy without a supportive media ecosystem that kind of emerged around the Trump campaign when it was in trouble.
Let me just revive something that came up in Claire Wardell's talk towards the end in the Q&A. We were talking about access to data. There is one data set that would get us much closer than anything currently available to answering that question in a quantitative way, which is Facebook data, where you have a real person who does or doesn't appear on the voter rolls as having voted or not voted, and you have the full record of communications to them. They're not sharing, and I doubt that they will share barring some regulatory intervention that will create a structure on the same model that we have for public health. People's online communications are not more sensitive than their health records. We have a system set up to allow public health researchers to look at people's personal health records under appropriate contractual and regulatory constraints with appropriate accreditation and appropriate protection for the ultimate privacy of the subjects, that nonetheless allows us to see where diseases come from and how they spread. And we need the same thing as a public health research community for our democracy.
I'm Hossein Darakhshan from Kennedy School Shorenstein Center, and I was the co-author of that report with Claire Wardell. Two comments, and there are actually maybe questions too. Have you looked into two things? One is the distinction between typography or word-centered content and video-centered content, and then the impact of television in the already popular accounts on social media. Because, you know, coming from the blogging time, like some other people my age or older, that time, I mean, there was a very clear distinction between online celebrities at the time and TV celebrities. So if you were popular and you had a big leadership, it wasn't coming because you were more visible on TV. But now increasingly, everyone who is popular on social media, part of this popularity, or I would say much of it, has come from the exposure that they get on television. So I think that's why I really love the fact that you mentioned television and its role. But I think if we would be able to analyze the data about how this drives, you know, becomes a cycle of exposure and popularity, I think it would be very important, because increasingly around the world, and I come from Iran and I know how things are there, Twitter is being more visible because of television. And I remember a research in the US where only 20% of people who had seen Trump's tweets had seen them on Twitter. The rest had seen it on television and other media. So I don't think we can actually anymore separate social media from television for many reasons, for many theoretical formal reasons, and also from this aspect.
So as you saw, we're working now on trying to integrate TV. Primarily, we're using now text-based transcript from television archive. That's still relatively crude, but that's the best there is. I agree. We need it. Images are hard. Our work is basically text, link, tweet, Facebook share, and then human eyes looking at stuff that the text raises when it's visual. That's what we have at the moment. I think that's the next set of things that we need to work on. I agree.
So it is actually the case that the television archive with archive.org, they do facial recognition. So you can go and you can search to see, when, Pelosi appeared on which shows. They restrict it right now to what they call public figures. So they're obviously recognize everybody, but they have legitimate privacy concerns. So that's a really good, juicy question that we interact with a lot in the space, as Yochai just pointed out, with trying to get the private Facebook info. We quickly get down to the level of having these sort of privacy concerns. But that certainly would be a fantastic project, considering those privacy concerns, to be able to track appearances online as well as on TV. The other thing I'll just say, you just asked about sort of the difference between sort of television or video and text. The one huge difference that was fascinating for me of mapping out the YouTube videos is there's an enormous amount of positive coverage in YouTube, which we never, ever see anything at all positive online. Like it's all, if you search for mentions of candidates, the right only talks about Trump, or the right only talks about Clinton, and the left only talks about Trump, because it's all just negative, and the mainstream media talks negatively about both of them. But YouTube is like, I actually don't have we haven't done the specific numbers, but if you just look at the map, if you look at the top videos, I would say it's about half and half. Like there's a lot of you go and it's like some schmaltzy, inspirational video about how great Trump is or how great Sanders is. There was zero pro Clinton. There was, if you remember that YouTube map that we showed, there was a big Trump cluster, there's a big Sanders cluster, and then there was a small sort of mainstream liberal cluster. There was no pro-Clinton anywhere, for what that's worth.
Who's keeping the time? One more question and we move on. Hi.
Hi, Sasha Costanza-Chalk from MIT. I have a brief comment and a question. The comment is just about the recent report that came out from the Knight Foundation, authored by Dean Freeland, Sarah Jackson, Lori Lopez, and I think some others, looking at Black Twitter, feminist Twitter, and Asian American Twitter in relation to mass media journalism. And if you've seen that report, one of the really interesting findings is that almost all of the tweets that reference news stories in professional media outlets about those three communities are people critiquing and disagreeing and various flavors of hate tweeting the way that the mainstream media is getting those stories wrong. And so it's just a comment in the sense that a lot of the network data that we're looking at is visualizations of people tweeting these stories, and it doesn't necessarily tell us that much about their relationship to those stories and what they're saying about them. The question, though, is a broader theoretical question about so in terms of dealing with this stuff, in that matrix that you presented of technical solutions, political solutions, so on the technical side, how do the design affordances that we need to build to counter some of this shift if our version of public sphere theory isn't the unreconstructed Habermasian version, it's the Nancy Fraser Squires version that takes subaltern counterpublics into account and says groups of people with different positions of political power in a broader society do different things in the bubbles or in the subaltern counterpublic spheres that they create. So I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on that, because I'm worried that if we assume that all of these bubbles are equivalencies, we design ways to break through them, what we're doing is taking away power from the already least powerful. So how do you all think about that, and what do we learn about that approach from the work that you all are doing?
I think the challenge you raise at the end is the foundational challenge. One of the reasons, I think, that the public conversation in the US today is so centered on technology and so centered on Russians, and if anything else, it's Macedonian teenagers, is because that's easy. What's hard is when you realize that this is authentic American political action, some of which is deeply troubling, some of which is really problematic, and some of which is challenging, hard, but nonetheless to be celebrated as democratic expression. And who is who in these is itself a fundamental question of disagreement. And so when you have solutions like change the Facebook algorithm to only have your family, if you're focused only in one direction, great or not great. If you actually understand that there's a lot of activity that comes from excluded minorities, whether the minority is white supremacists or whether the minority is any other community that you consider to be a legitimate cluster of views in society that do have to have expression, it makes the solution really problematic with deeply problematic spillovers into what should count as part of the democratic conversation. One of the tensions that comes out of our work for us is that we would love to find things for which there are simple solutions. The more we look at it, the less likely it looks like there's going to be a simple solution where we don't do damage to public discourse while also doing good.
So I would add to that this idea we have of like truth and journalistic and scientific objectivity, it's very new. It's 50, 100 years old. We tend to treat it as that's the way the world has been, and oh, we have this new threat. No, this is the way the world has been for all of human history, and for maybe 50 or 100 years, it's been the case that we invest a lot of value as a society in this idea of journalistic objectivity, which is a very problematic value, as you point out. It marginalizes lots of communities. It's highly invested in the status quo. One thing we're seeing now is, not just now actually, for 60 of those 50 to 100 years, we've had roughly 40% of our population saying, no, that doesn't work for me. They're all liberal and they're not speaking for me. And what a lot of our work is finding, Yochai keeps on saying it's not technological. We're all like internet researchers that we're coming into this thinking it's going to be technological, right? Like that's our default. That's the null hypothesis is Facebook's going crazy, and we've just spent a lot of time steeped in this data. And now we're thinking, no, we've just got to watch more Fox News to really understand what's going on, right? So all this just says, the answer really is it's complicated, which is to say it's a really hard struggle with this idea of, hey, we have this status quo, journalistic and scientific objectivity, which is not working for lots of people for like 40% of our population on the right, but also for lots of marginalized communities. And there's a lot of really hard work that's a lot harder than Russian hackers to figure out how to sort of salvage that in a way where we can still have vaccines, right? And still have some sort of ground truth about what's the impact of policy in our country, but still accept that other people have voices other than, the executive editor of the New York Times.
Thank you so much.
Super.
Thank you. I think we're going slightly behind the schedule, so without further ado, we're going to listen to Alejandro